Assalamu alaikum ji. I'm your instructor Humair Hashmi, and we are dealing with history and systems of psychology, and we are into the 31st lecture today. We had been talking about a very interesting man in the last two lectures, and we talked about some of his points of view, some of his practices, and then we talked about some of his followers. I want to touch upon another very prominent and an interesting character in the history of psychology, but before we do that, let us recapture, let us review what we had done related to Freud in the last two lectures. Lecture number 30, we talked about Freud, and in that we particularly touched upon a number of things. The first thing that we touched upon in the last lecture was his theory of defense mechanisms. Can you recall what defense mechanisms in Freud's point of view were? Defense mechanisms of the ego. How the ego regulates, plays the role of a referee between id on the one hand and the superego on the other hand. And the mechanisms, the roles that ego adopts in referring these two opposing demands of personality, the demands of the id and then the commands of the superego. The ego plays a role of a mediator between these two parts of personality. One of the defense mechanisms that we talked about was projection. Another we talked about was denial. And I hope you are revising all of these as we go forward. We then talked about his theory of neurosis. Do you know what is the difference that we talked about in the last lecture between neurosis and psychosis? एक आम फहम सा difference बताइए. I don't want you to remember very technical differences. I don't want you to go into those details. You will go into those details in clinical and abnormal psychology. But for the sake of clarification here, can you recall, or if you have already done in clinical or abnormal psychology, the difference between neurosis and psychosis? Could you revise that in your mind? Neurosis is, that's right, a milder form of mental disorder, and so psychosis is a more severe, a more chronic form of mental disorder. We are talking about Freud's theory of neurosis, and he explains it in terms of a predisposition. एक शख्स ज़हनी अमराज की तरफ माइल है, उसकी तबीयत में, उसकी शख्सियत में, उसकी प्रीवियस ट्रेनिंग में, उसके हालात में कुछ ऐसी चीज़ें हैं कि वो ज़हनी अमराज की तरफ दूसरे लोगों की निस्बत ज़्यादा माइल है. That is what he considers disposition. And the second thing that he talked about in relation to development of neurosis was a trauma. Trauma, if you remember, is a severe emotional shock. मैंने आपको एक मीर तकी मीर की मिसाल दी थी. मैंने आपको हमारे पाकिस्तानी एक्टर जो अब वफात पा चुके हैं वहीद मुराद की मिसाल दी थी, और भी तारीख में बहुत सी मिसालें ऐसी हैं जहां एक जज्बाती धचका जो है, trauma has resulted in the development of a mental disease or a neurosis. And that is what Freud had postulated, that neurosis is equal to predisposition plus trauma. ये उसकी हमने पिछले लेक्चर में जिक्र किया था, और फिर हमने काफ़ी डिटेल में मैंने आपसे गुजारिशात की थी of the method of treatment called psychoanalysis that Freud had developed, invented and developed and perfected. And in that regard, we talked about 5 main elements that Freud used. Number 1, free association as a method of treatment. Number 2, interpretation of psychopathology of everyday life. We talked about number 3, dream interpretation, ख्वाबों की ताबीर, as a method of treatment of mental disorders in psychoanalysis. 4, we talked about resistance and attitude of the patient to cling to his neurosis, to not let it go off. And 5th, we talked about analysis of transference, the relationship of affection and even love and understanding that takes place in the course of psychoanalysis between the patient and the physician, the psychoanalyst, was transference, and Freud thought that was the last step of treating mental disorders, that the physician gets the patient to stand on his own firm feet, on a firm ground, without the help and guidance of the therapist. And that is the last stage in the development of a person from being a mentally sick person to becoming a healthy person. These were the 5 methodologies used by psychoanalysts, developed, invented by Freud. We then talked about 3 of his important followers, which we have called, or which historians have called, ego psychologists or ego psychoanalysts. First of these was his own daughter, Anna Freud, who, while explaining the concept of functions of the ego, talks about identification with the aggressor in children as one of the defense mechanisms of the ego. Then we talked about Heinz Hartmann, who also dwelt upon the functions of the ego, and he put forward the view that one of the main functions of the ego, according to Hartmann, was that it integrates a personality into a whole, into a pattern. And the third person that we talked about in that regard was Ernest Chris, who explained how regression is regulated, controlled by the ego. और क्योंकि ये तीनों माहिरीन नफ्सियात साइको एनालिसिस स्कूल से ही मुतल्लिक थे, और क्योंकि ये तीनों लोग ईगो के फंक्शंस का जिक्र करते हैं, इसलिए बाद के तारीख़ नवीसों ने, जिन्होंने नफ्सियात की तारीख़ लिखी, उन्होंने इन लोगों को, इन तीनों को ईगो साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स या ईगो साइकोएनालिस्ट्स ही कहा है. Now this was the main shape, structure and contribution of psychoanalysis and the psychoanalytical movement. Let us go forward of that and touch upon another very important psychoanalyst, but a physician, but somebody who broke off in his later life from classical Freudian psychoanalysis and developed his own system of theory and his own system of treatment of mental disorders. His name was Carl Gustav Jung. Spelling पढ़िए, C-A-R-L, Carl Gustav, G-U-S-T-A-V आपकी स्क्रीन पे लिखा है, और J-U-N-G written as Jung लेकिन it's pronounced as Jung, who studied medicine. Actually, his father and a lot of his family members were men of church. पादरी या priests रहे वो, और उनका यही ख्याल था that young Jung, छोटी नौजवान Jung जो है, वो भी he will go into the service of church, but Jung went into medicine, and from medicine, after having gotten his degree as a doctor, he changed over to treatment of mental disorders, remained in Zurich, in Switzerland, and died, worked most of his life there, and he died there. He was very impressed with Freud. He had read all of Freud before he ever met Freud. He met Freud in the opening years of the 20th century. First he wrote to Freud, and then Freud invited him over to Vienna, and that's where they met. The first meeting quickly developed into a deep friendship and a deep mutual respect and admiration. एक दूसरे के लिए उनके दिल में बहुत तारीफ और इज्जत के जज्बात थे. But later on, Jung broke off with Freud on a number of bases, but the important base was that Freud had ignored, in his point of view, the influence of the unconscious. Jung believed that Freud did not put as much emphasis on the impulses that come from the unconscious in the development of personality, and in the development of a person, and in the development of neurosis. And that was one of the breakaway points between these two great thinkers. Another breakaway point was that Jung thought that Freud put too much emphasis on sex as a drive, as a determinant of human behavior. आपको याद है, मैंने जब फ्रॉयड का जिक्र हम कर रहे थे, तो मैंने आपसे गुजारिश की थी that Freud talked about psychosexual development, how people develop. Keeping that in view, Jung believed that Freud overemphasized the role of sex in life. This was another breakaway point. And in later years, he completely broke off with the psychoanalytical system and developed his own theory and his own methodology of treatment of mental disorders. His theory and his system is called analytical psychology. Let us now go deeper into Jung's system, his point of view, and see what he has to offer us. Jung agreed with Freud that the unconscious has an important part to play in the determination of personality, in bringing on neurosis in a person. But he disagreed with Freud that Freud did not explain the concept of the unconscious fully. All right? What is Jungian point of view about the unconscious? Jung puts forward the view that unconscious has layers. The upper layer is what he calls the personal unconscious. And then there is a lower, deeper layer that he calls the collective unconscious. That was one of the main points of disagreement between Freud and Jung. Their concepts of the unconscious. जैसे मैंने आपको बताया कि Jung का ये ख्याल था कि फ्रॉयड ने लाशऊर के बारे में जो अहमियत है लाशऊर की, उसका पूरी तरह से तज्जिया और जिक्र नहीं किया अपने सिस्टम में, और युंग ने इसी चीज को आगे इलेबरेट किया है, इसी को उन्होंने वजाहत से बयान किया। चलिए इनकी वजाहत भी देख लेते हैं। द फर्स्ट लेयर ऑफ द अनकॉन्शियस, वो चीजें जो हमारे शऊर से बाहर हैं लेकिन लाशऊर में मौजूद हैं, दैट इज द अपर लेयर of the unconscious in Jungian theory or Jungian system. He calls it the personal unconscious. The personal unconscious contains the repressed wishes and desires. वो ख्वाहिशात, वो तवक्कुआत जो पूरी नहीं होती, वो ख्वाहिशात जो पूरी नहीं होती एक शख्स में, वो चीजें जो वो करना चाहता है लेकिन कर नहीं सकता, दे इन जुंग्स पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू आर रिप्रेस्ड, फॉरगॉटन, ऐसे ही जैसे उनके ऊपर एक लिड रख दी जाए, एंड देन दोज थिंग्स एंटर इन व्हाट युंग कॉल्स द पर्सनल अनकॉन्शियस. नाउ व्हेन यू लुक एट इट फ्रॉम द अदर पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू, what is the personal unconscious? It consists what has been repressed, what has not been allowed to be expressed. Very easy to understand. Personal unconscious is the upper layer. But then there is a deeper and a more broad and a darker layer in Jungian system of personality theory, and that is what he calls the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is inherited. It is not something that comes into being as a result of repression or forgetting or suppressing things or not allowing wishes and desires to be expressed. The collective unconscious opposed to this is the experiences of the forefathers contained in the form of certain patterns that are to be found in the collective unconscious. For instance, man's experience with his inferiority, man's experience with a woman's experience with a man, man's experience as a child, man's experience with the forces which are over and above him. All of these, in Jung's point of view, are collective experiences that our forefathers, that are past many generations experienced. Those are passed on to a person, and those formulate the collective unconscious. If you look at it now, conversely, what does the collective unconscious have? Certain experiences contained in the collective unconscious in the forms of certain patterns. Those patterns he calls archetypes. जैसा कि आप स्क्रीन पे देख रहे हैं, archetype, ARCHETYPES. Archetype is a pattern, a kind of, इस तरह आप समझ लीजिए कि ये एक शख्स के ज़हन में एक सांचा है, और ये सांचा कैसे बना है? Because of his inheriting the experience of many generations. Now let's take a look at this collective unconscious. Collective unconscious has many archetypes. The deeper layer of the unconscious, Jung's disagreement with Freud was that Freud had not really elaborated the concept, the functions of the unconscious. So Jung goes forward and explains the unconscious. And in that explanation, he puts forward the view that there is the personal unconscious, the upper layer, and then there is the deeper layer, the bigger layer of the unconscious, which he calls the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious contains a person's repressed wishes and desires. The collective unconscious contains archetypes, patterns of feeling, doing, thinking, being, all of these transformed into archetype and passed on from one generation to the other, to the other, to the other, to the other, and contained in the collective unconscious in the form of archetypes. और युंग बहुत सी आर्कीटाइप्स का जिक्र करता है. मैं आपको उनमें से चंद अहम आर्कीटाइप्स का बता देता हूं. You would read about them in great detail, perhaps at your master's level, or perhaps when you're specializing in Jungian analysis. Who knows, you might be one of the prominent Jungian analysts in Pakistan. Some of the archetypes that Jung talks about, as you can see on your screen, the first one is anima, A-N-I-M-A. Anima is the archetype of a woman in man. In Jungian theory, every man is at least in part a woman also, in terms of his having the archetype of anima. And anima, the archetype of anima, expresses itself, the woman in man expresses itself in being a man being like a woman. एक क्वालिटी ख़वातीन की ये भी है कि वो टेंडर हैं, वो अफेक्शनेट हैं. Women are generally tender, affectionate and sentimental. Men are competitive, harsh, aggressive and apparently without sentiments. But all men have those qualities also, of being sentimental, of being temperamental, of being affectionate. आपने देखा है ऑपरा सुनते हुए, गाना सुनते हुए मर्द रोना शुरू कर देते हैं. They become sentimental. That is, in Jung's point of view, an expression of the woman in man that he calls the archetype of anima. The sentimentality, the emotionality, the affection in a man is an expression of the archetype of anima. Another archetype that Jung talks about that is contained in the unconscious is the animus, the man in a woman. I just told you, a man is competitive, aggressive, and apparently without emotions or sentiments. Some women, sometimes all women are like that. They are competitive, they are aggressive, and they seem to be without emotions and sentiments. They are harsh, they are straight, ramrod. And that is what Jung calls the expression of the archetype of animus in a woman. Another archetype, interesting, aren't they? Another archetype that Jung talks about is the archetype of persona. Persona is, it literally means a mask. Jung puts forward the view that all of us wear a mask. Do you think you wear a mask? Consider, I think you do, the mask of a student, the mask of a brother, the mask of a son, the mask of a sister, the mask of a daughter, the mask of a husband, the mask of a wife, the mask of a boss, the mask of a manager, the mask of a supervisor. All of these are the kind of roles that we perform, and Jung calls them masks. All of these put together is what Jung calls the archetype of persona. We wear masks. The mask is the role that we adopt. A man is expected to adopt the role of a man. Boys don't cry. Men don't cry. So his mask is one of a hardened person who doesn't easily give into emotion and doesn't easily cry or weep. A woman's persona or mask is, a girl's persona or mask is that she is shy, that she keeps her distance, that she keeps her vanity, that she is not loud, that she is not strong, that she is relatively weak. That is the mask that a woman may wear. And that is what Jung means when he says that we all have roles to play. We play those roles all the time. And those roles are collectively called the persona, the mask. And that is another archetype that is contained in the collective unconscious. Another archetype that Jung talks about is the archetype of shadow. आपकी स्क्रीन पे भी आपको दिखाई दे रहा होगा. Shadow in Jungian terminology is the inferior in a person. अल्लाह ताला की ज़ात बारी ही ऐसी ज़ात है जिसमें कोई खामी मौजूद नहीं है. इंसानों में, आप में और मुझ में खामियां हैं, और यही खामियां जो हैं ये हमारा इंफीरियर फंक्शन है. इसी को युंग शैडो कहता है. कोई शख्स लालची है, कोई बुज़दिल है, कोई जल्दी घबरा जाता है. ये तमाम चीजें जो हैं ये इंफीरियर फंक्शंस समझे जाते हैं, और ये हम सब में, बनी नौ इंसान, तमाम इंसानों में ये किसी न किसी हद तक मौजूद हैं. जो हमसे बेहतर इंसान हैं उनमें ये खामियां कम हैं, तादाद में भी और मिकदार में भी. और जो हमारी तरह और आपकी तरह के मॉर्टल बीइंग्स हैं, फानी इंसान जो हैं, उनमें ये खामियां ज्यादा मौजूद हैं. All of us, therefore, have inferiorities. All of us have weaknesses. All of us have infirmities. And these inferiorities, weaknesses, and infirmities are contained in an archetype that Jung calls the shadow. No one is without a shadow. Obviously, जैसे मैंने पहले गुजारिश की, परफेक्ट तो सिर्फ ज़ात बारी ताला ही है. इसलिए हम सब में ये खामियां मौजूद हैं, और युंग के ख्याल में हम सब में ये खामियां जो हैं ये शैडो में कंटेन्ड हैं. सो in Jungian theory, personality is personal and collective unconscious. The personal unconscious is what we repress, and the collective unconscious is what we have inherited in terms of archetypes. That's an important contribution in Jung's analytical psychology. Let us go forward of this and let us take a look at another of his concepts, which is interesting. If you were to read Jung in original, you would find him a bit confusing, because he elaborates these points of view in a very detailed manner. So what I would like you to do is read about Jung by one of his followers, such as Frida Fordham, such as Michael Fordham. Pick up any one of their books and read them. You would find Jung very interesting. ये ऐसे ही है जैसे किस्से कहानियां हैं, आपको पढ़ने में मजा आएगा. चलिए इससे आगे चलते हैं. Based upon Jung's extensive clinical practice and based upon his experiments, he did a lot of experiments which are now called experiments in association. Based upon his theory, based upon his practice and his experiments, he developed a theory of personality. A theory of personality is that he defined personality, that he showed various types of personality, and then he went on to describe the various functions of personality. That's another important contribution of Jung's. Let us go deeper into his personality theory and take a look at that. आपको ये terms शायद पहले भी पता होंगी. Jung put forward the view that there are two personality types. यूं समझ लीजिए कि अगर हम बनी नौ इंसान को तकसीम करें उसकी पर्सनैलिटी थियोरी के रोशनी में, तो एक टाइप के होंगे और दूसरी टाइप के होंगे. One he called the introverted personality types. Introverted personality types are the people who are more into themselves, who do not want too much social stimulation, who avoid social gatherings, who prefer a smaller circle of friends, who have hobbies where they can be involved only by themselves, who have very deep relationships but only with one or two people, who would rather keep to themselves than seek the company of others. This is one personality type. And the other personality type that Jung talks about is what he calls the extroverted personality type. The extroverted personality type are opposite of the introverted. The extroverted types seek the company of others. They grow and glow in the company of others. They prefer, dislike, hate being by themselves or being alone or being with one or two people. Extroverts are people who would go out of their way to be amongst people. If you look at professions, if you look at choice of games, you would notice that chess players would be introverted. The cricket or hockey or team game players would be extroverted. That stamp collectors would be introverted, because stamp collecting doesn't involve too much of social gathering. or social contact. That people in the show business would be extroverted. They like being appreciated. They want to be in groups. That philosophers, by and large, would be introverted. That actors, by and large, would be extroverted. देख रहे हैं आप? This is how Jung says you can divide humanity into different parts. Two types of personality, introverted type and the extroverted type. आप बताइए, अपने आप को आप जानते हैं, आपका क्या ख्याल है? आप इंट्रोवर्टेड हैं या एक्सट्रोवर्टेड हैं? आप बताइए, आपके असातिज़ा, कोई उस्ताद या आपके वालिदा या आपके वालिद या आपकी वालिदा, क्या वो इंट्रोवर्टेड हैं या एक्सट्रोवर्टेड हैं? ज़रा नोट कीजिए और जहन में लाइए. चलिए इससे आगे चलते हैं. Jung also talks about certain functions of personality. We have talked about his personality type. He also talks about functions of personality. शख्सियत बनी कैसे है? शख्सियत या इंट्रोवर्ट है, अंदरूं भी है, या एक्सट्रोवर्ट है, बैरून भी है. लेकिन उसका इजहार कैसे होता है? How does personality function? Jung talks about 4 functions of personality. What are those 4 functions of personality? First function of personality is what he calls the sensory function. That a person may predominantly be a sensory type, which means that he is somebody who enjoys hot and cold weather, who does not think too much, who is not into sentimentality, who lives by his sensations. Sensation seekers, वो लोग जो विली कर रहे हैं आजकल, आप जानते हैं, those people who drive very fast on the motorbikes or very fast on the city roads, Jung would describe them as sensory types. They are people who enjoy the thrill of speed. Mountaineers enjoy the thrill of walking up a mountain. Skiers enjoy the thrill of coming down. Divers enjoy the thrills. People who go on sailing are people who enjoy the thrill of sensations. So Jung would call them the sensory type of people. And then there are the thinking type, the second type of personality, or the second way in which the personality expresses itself is what Jung calls the thinking function. सोच विचार करने वाले शख्स, philosophers, chess players, bridge players, ये जो लोग हैं, scholars, किताब लिखने वाले, mathematicians, these are people whom Jung would call the thinking type, or this is the thinking function of personality. And then there is the third function of personality, which Jung calls the emoting function of personality. The thrill of feeling the emotion and enjoying the emotion. That is what is the emoting type. Emoting type are people who react to emotions of others and who are themselves emotional. आपने देखा होगा, आपके दोस्त यार के सर्कल में लोग कहते हैं मैं जज्बाती हो गया. ये जिसको वो कह रहे हैं मैं जज्बाती हो गया, ये क्या चीज है? दिस इज इन Jungian theory the emoting function of personality. The third and the fourth is what he calls the intuiting function of personality. वो लोग जो विजदान पर, इंट्यूशन पर यकीन रखते हैं, और वो लोग जो इंट्यूशन के जरिए अपने आप को आगे बढ़ाते हैं, जो ये समझते हैं कि उनकी जिंदगी का दारो मदार या उनके गिर्द व नवाह की जो चीजें हैं उनका दारो मदार किसी गैबी फोर्स और कुव्वत के हाथ में है और वही उनको चला रही है, गैबी कुव्वत या फोर्स। ये एक इजहार है ऐसी शख्सियत का युंग के ख्याल में जो इंट्यूटिव फंक्शन पर्सनैलिटी का शो करती है। सो युंग इज टॉकिंग अबाउट टू टाइप्स ऑफ पर्सनैलिटी, इंट्रोवर्टेड टाइप and the extroverted type, and he talks about 4 functions of personality. So we have a total of 8 personality types: introverted sensory, introverted thinking, introverted emotive, introverted intuitive, and then extroverted sensory, extroverted thinking, extroverted emoting, and extroverted intuiting type. In Jung's personality theory, there are 8 personality types. Introverted, extroverted, each having 4 functions. Interesting theory, isn't it? इस सारी थियरी का, युंग की पर्सनैलिटी की थियरी का, उसके तरीका इलाज पे कोई असर है? इस सारी थियरी से उसने क्या नताइज अख्ज़ किए? We will talk about that in the next lecture related to Jung. And before we close today, let me recap, let me recollect what we had talked about related to Jung today. आम तौर पे युंग के नुक्ता नज़र को, युंग के ख्यालात को मुबहम, एम्बिगुअस, अनक्लियर समझा जाता है और कुछ मेरे ख्याल में और कुछ और बड़े माहिरीन नफ्सियात के ख्याल में ऐसा है भी. His points of view may be a little complicated and a little ambiguous, but they are very interesting. Let us review what we talked about related to Jung. He was a great friend of Freud's. In fact, Freud nominated him to be the president of the International Psychoanalytical Congress. He visited many universities along with Freud on the North American continent. दोनों ने, युंग और फ्रॉयड ने लेक्चर्स दिए हैं अमेरिका में जाके. दोनों की दोस्ती बहुत रही. And then a time came when Jung broke off with his mentor and his teacher Sigmund Freud, and he developed his own theory. I told you that he broke off on the basis of many reasons, but the 2 important ones were that he thought that Freud had put too much emphasis on the concept of sex, the role of sex in one's life. He also broke off with Freud on the basis of the fact that Jung thought that Freud had not elaborated the concept of the unconscious. He had not dug up. Jung thought Freud had not dug up the deeper layers of the unconscious, and that these two, apart from other, were differences that really developed into a big difference, and then the break came. Jung developed his own system, which is now called analytical psychology. He gave us the concept of, he elaborates the concept of the personal unconscious. That is what we talked about today. And he talks about the concept of the collective unconscious. If you remember, the personal unconscious is what we have in our minds, लाशऊर में वो चीज़ें जो हम repress करते हैं. That is a part of our personal unconscious, ज़ाती लाशऊर. And then, in Jung's theory, there is a deeper layer of the unconscious, which he called the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious it contains archetypes. Archetypes are experiences of generations contained in a person's mind of how he feels, how he thinks, how he looks at life. In describing the collective unconscious, Jung had talked about a number of forces within there, a number of patterns within there. And those forces or patterns he called archetypes. हमने 3-4 archetypes का जिक्र किया. उनमें the archetype of anima, which is the woman in a man. When a man behaves sentimentally, when a man starts to cry looking at a movie, that is an expression of his archetype of anima. The other archetype that Jung talked about was animus. That is the man in a woman. When the woman becomes aggressive and competitive and harsh and hard, that is, in Jung's point of view, the expression of the animus, the man in a woman. And then he talks about persona, the mask that we wear, the roles that we adopt in life, is another archetype. And then he talks about the archetype of shadow, the inferior in us, the low in us. And that is one of the contributions of Jung. The other contribution, Jungian contribution, is his concept of the functions and the types of personality. He talks about 2 types of personality, introverted and the extroverted. The introverted is who would rather be by himself or herself, who shuns social company. Extroverted is who likes social company, who wants to be in the limelight. And then Jung talks about functions of personality. He talks about 4 functions of personality: the sensory function, the thinking function, the emoting function, and the intuitive function. So, in Jung's system, personality may express itself in 8 different ways. You may have an introverted thinking type, emoting type, intuiting type, or sensory type. And similarly, you may have an extroverted thinking, emoting, sensing, or intuitive type of personality. All of these impact the way we are. All of these functions of personality, the types of personality, and the forces that lie within the personal and the collective unconscious impact the person as a whole. It also determines mental illness. We will talk about more of Jung's system in the next lecture. Do read Jung in original, and if you enjoy, certainly buy his books and read them. There are many people who've written about Jung, even Pakistani people, in Urdu, and you can find them and read about them. Until the next time, Khuda Hafiz, God be with you. Assalamu alaikum ji. I'm your instructor for History and Systems of Psychology, and we are into the 32nd lecture today. Last time we had talked about a very prominent psychotherapist, a physician, a European doctor who left a great name for himself, a very prominent place for himself in the systems of psychology. His name was, can you recall? That's right, C.G. Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, who had been educated and who practiced in Zurich. Do you know where Zurich is? Switzerland. We had covered some part of his system. I'm calling it a system, as we had called Freud's entire theory and his methodology a system, because these gentlemen developed a theoretical framework based upon their education, previous training, experience, and research. Based upon all of these empirically collected data, they developed their own ways of evaluating human disease, particularly mental disease, and then developed their own system of the treatment of those diseases. And that is why we call their contributions systems. We had looked at Jung's system, and he preferred to call it analytical psychology. We had talked about some parts of his system. Before we talk about the other contributions that he made within this system, let us first review what we had seen in the past lecture related to C.G. Jung. I will give you a few seconds, I will give you 3 seconds to revise in your mind what we talked about related to Jung and his system of analytical psychology. That's right. These are your 3 seconds. We talked about, as a review, let us take a look at it. We talked about his concept of the collective and the personal unconscious. He had distinguished between 2 or some layers of the unconscious. If you remember, he disagreed with Freud on the basis that he thought that Freud had not really explained the contribution of the unconscious in determining a man's entire life, including mental disease. That was one of the reasons of his dissent, of his disagreement from Freud. So Jung gave us the theory of his, elaborately explained theory of his related to the concept of the unconscious. And he talked about, if you remember, 2 layers or 2 types of the unconscious mind. One that he called the collective unconscious, and the other that he called the personal unconscious. The personal unconscious, if you recall, was what a person, an individual represses, जो वो काबिल कबूल बात नहीं समझता एक शख्स और उसको अपने जहन से बाहर निकाल देता है, तो वही मवाद जो है युंग के ख्याल में वो उसके ज़ाती लाशऊर में चला जाता है. That material in Jung's theory that a person represses, forgets, throws out, that goes into what he calls his personal unconscious. And then there is the deeper layer which he called the collective unconscious. Or what is it that the collective unconscious contains? The collective unconscious in Jung's theory is a collection of the experiences of generations contained as archetypes in our unconscious. और दूसरी सतह जो यूंग बता रहा है हमें हमारे लाशऊर की, वो है जिसको वो कहता है इज्तमाई लाशऊर, या जिसको अंग्रेजी में वो कलेक्टिव अनकॉन्शियस कह रहा है. और इज्तमाई लाशऊर में क्या है? हमारे आबाओ अजदाद के तजुर्बात, एहसासात, आर्कीटाइप्स या नसख तमसाल की सूरत में. इसका तर्जुमा माहिरीन नफ्सियात ने आर्कीटाइप का नसख तमसाल किया है. आर्कीटाइप्स की सूरत में या नसख तमसाल की सूरत में हमारे इज्तमाई जहन में ये चीज़ें मौजूद हैं जो हमारे आबाओ अजदाद ने सदियों तक एक्सपीरियंस की हैं. और हमने यूंग की ही एक्सप्लेनेशन में बताया था आपको कि ये आर्कीटाइप्स जो हैं, there are many archetypes that Jung talks about, but we talked about 4 of them in this context. And the first one was anima, that is the female in a man. And then we talked about the animus, the male in a woman. Now remember, we are not talking about archetypes in reference to anima and animus in physical sense. We are talking about archetypes in spiritual, psychical sense. So we are not talking about, when we say anima, as if there is a woman in a man. Not at all, not that physically, but in a spiritual, psychological, psychical sense. इसी तरह से जब हम या यूंग बात करता है एनिमस की, तो उससे ये मुराद नहीं लेना चाहिए, और ना उसने ऐसा कहा है. कुछ हमारे बच्चे ये भी समझते हैं कि शायद यही वजह है कि यूंग एक शख्स को पूरी तरह से मर्द या औरत नहीं कह रहा. ऐसी बात बिल्कुल नहीं है, ये यूंग ने कभी भी नहीं कहा, तो इसको ऐसे ना समझिएगा. When Jung is talking about animus as an image, an archetype of a man in a woman, what he really means